I first want to invite up Ambassador Dennis Ross, who many of you know as counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And before returning to the Washington Institute, he served as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council senior director for the Central Region, and also had been a special advisor to Hillary Clinton. But don't forget, he was the U.S. point man on the peace process in George H.W. Bush's and Bill Clinton's administration, and also served in the Reagan administration. Next, I'd like to invite up Khalid El-Gindi, who's a fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy here at Brookings and founding board member of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. He also served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel, and was also a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations that were held throughout 2008. And last but not at all least, I want to invite up Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, who's director of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and she focuses on the interplay of Israeli and Palestinian civil society and peace-building efforts, as well as official diplomacy. So, Dennis, I want to start with you by asking about how Prime Minister Netanyahu has paid a political price for accepting the ceasefire. And so give us the sort of larger view of how the Israeli political situation affects the ability of this Israeli government to do anything in Gaza that the authors are proposing.
Okay, Natan touched on this a little bit, but I'll pick up on what he was saying. First, one of the things that guided the Prime Minister was recognizing that if Israel went in on the ground in Gaza, it was completely no-win. Even if it goes in and militarily defeats Hamas, what has it won? It has probably lost anywhere from 70 to 100 soldiers. It has probably in the process killed maybe as many as a couple thousand Palestinians. It has gained great stigma again internationally. And if it has decimated the Hamas leadership, then that has created a vacuum in Gaza that either it has to fill itself by staying in Gaza, which nobody in Israel wants to do, or if it gets out, who takes the place? Israel always needs an address in Gaza to hold somebody responsible. So this is a case where you use force, you lose a lot, and you gain nothing. And he understood it was basically no win. The problem that he faced, however, is that all of those who live in the south, I happened to be in Israel at the time, the day that before the ceasefire was declared, and you had about 1 million people in shelters in the south. You even had one Israeli minister who said, well, okay, but it didn't affect commerce because it didn't touch Tel Aviv. I mean, ironically, the same day before the ceasefire was declared, you had a night run in Tel Aviv that involved thousands of people doing a 10K. Yeah, everything that was going on in Gaza, it was as if it was on a different planet. So much of Israel wasn't touched by it, but everybody who lived in the south was touched by it. Now, those who live in the south, by the way, also tend to be overwhelmingly Likud supporters. Mm-hmm. So you're the Prime Minister of Israel. What you've done doesn't deal at all with the security of those who are your supporters who feel, what, we're lesser citizens than everybody else? So that creates a political dynamic that was difficult for him, but he weighed the consequence of going in and producing a conflict that left Israel basically certainly not better off and potentially worse off, and even politically. One thing about being prime ministers in Israel, when you preside over conflicts that don't look like they're winning conflicts, it's not usually a great political benefit. He, of all prime ministers, somehow managed in 2014 a conflict that went on for 52 days and basically reestablished the status quo ante, and he didn't pay a political price for it. But you look at Ehud Olmert in 2006, 34 days in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and he never regained his kind of political credibility. So the prime minister managed it once, but he understood this is hard to manage for a second time. So that's point one. Point two is that now, having been subject to the resignation of the defense minister claiming you didn't do what you should have done, you were too soft, you claim you're Mr. Security, but you're not Mr. Security, that kind of moniker has been, in fact, something that has always described Prime Minister Netanyahu before the Israeli public and has built a strong political support. I mean, come this July, if he's still prime minister, and he probably will be the longest-serving prime minister ever in Israel, longer than Ben-Gurion. So he knows how to manage his politics, but now he's going to face what are really difficult politics because, A, this is clearly an election season. Whether the election, I doubt the election will take place in November. It'll take place before then. Maybe September, maybe May, but every decision he now makes is going to be framed against that reality. And how does he look like he's still the keeper of security? Hamas, by the way, understands that he's probably on a much shorter leash than he was before. So my guess is they're going to be more careful as well. They're not looking exactly for a conflict either, although they have created a new normal, which from their standpoint in some way works to their advantage because it puts pressure on Israel and it puts pressure on the PA as well. But they understand that in the coming months, it's going to be that you're going to have a prime minister who is, even if he doesn't want to get into a ground conflict in Gaza, is going to fight it harder and harder politically to avoid it. He cannot look soft. The second thing is it'll also be very difficult for him to do any of the things that would make it possible to alleviate the electricity, water, and sewage treatment. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the discussion before is the inability to power sewage treatment plants, which also in the end happens to be in Israeli interest because we've had to shut down the desalination plant in Ashkelon several times because of the sewage flowing from Gaza towards Israel. These are areas where Israel has an interest. You have to probably create a distinction between what is a technical need as opposed to a reconstruction need. But even on a technical need, he's going to want to be very careful about not looking like he's soft on Hamas right now. So the politics, I think, make it harder in the near term to take some of the steps that are outlined in the study. And they also, I think, mean that the potential for a quick escalation that isn't so easy to control will also be quite high. The irony is that maybe that gets each side to be a little bit more careful in the near term.
All right. Khalid, I'd like you to bring in for us the Palestinian perspective. And given that when it comes to Gaza, both Hamas and the PA, Fatah, have their own partisan and parochial interests, how do we forge a national strategy or an integrated interest out of this for them? I mean, not that we should do it for them, but how do you see it happening?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question in terms of Palestinian politics. As you pointed out, for the time being, both Fatah and Hamas and their responses to Gaza are driven primarily by their partisan and parochial interests. Hamas would like to give up responsibility for having to govern Gaza. It hasn't worked. I think initially it seemed like a good idea if they can project their governance success in this piece of Palestine, that could perhaps carry over elsewhere, but it hasn't worked largely because of the blockade and because of the fragmentation of Palestinian politics more generally. But for a whole host of reasons, they've decided we want to get out of the governance business. We'd like to remain in the resistance business, and so we're not prepared to give up our weapons as the Israelis or the PA have demanded. And from the standpoint of Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership, he's not in a hurry to share power with Hamas. He's not in a hurry to share power with anyone. He's from a party that is accustomed to dominating exclusively Palestinian politics, whether it's the PA or the PLO, for decades. And so this idea of sharing power, even though Fatah lost an election in 2007, 2006, is still fairly new and not something that they're keen to do. And to the extent that his leadership has been willing to consider reconciliation with Hamas, it's been largely driven from the grassroots. There is a public outcry against the continued division, and that's really what has driven his leadership to reconciliation talks. But as we've seen, many reconciliation talks have been signed between the two groups and other factions, but not its main pieces haven't yet been implemented. I would argue, even with all of that in mind, as bad as the security situation is, of course, it's also linked to the very dire humanitarian situation. But at the end of the day, the Gaza crisis, the roots of the Gaza crisis are political. And I think that is the fact that the Israeli leadership over the past decade or more, and to a very large extent with American acquiescence, has not been willing to come to terms with. It's political in the sense that Hamas is a political movement. It's political in the sense that the blockade that was imposed after the Hamas election victory was politically motivated. It was about defeating or even removing Hamas from power politically. And at the end of the day, Gaza is part and parcel of the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict that, depending on how we measure, is at least 50 years old, 70 years old, maybe even 100 years old. And so there are underlying issues that are political that need to be resolved. And throw into the mix this political fragmentation and division of the Palestinian polity that creates all these opportunities for spoilers on all sides. And those are the kind of the core issues that I think any credible peace process has to address. We can't simply deal with Gaza as a humanitarian issue or as a security issue, which has been the tendency so far by U.S. policymakers, even before this administration. They need to start addressing, and I think the report does emphasize this, they need to start addressing the political roots of Gaza's problems. And I think that begins with a sort of a mental step that has to be taken that is very difficult, which is to accept that Hamas is a political reality, whether we like them or not. At the end of the day, peace is made between enemies, people who hate each other, people who do and say bad things to one another. That's the essence of peace. You don't make peace with your friends.
Lucy, I want you to tell us a bit about this simulation that U.S. Institute of Peace did that I think Natan referred to in the first panel. So, this is, well, lay it out for us.
Certainly. So thank you. So to underscore, actually, and Dennis just mentioned, put a big underline under some of the data that Hedy mentioned in the first panel, laying out the really dire humanitarian and economic situation in Gaza. And the fact that this doesn't just impact Gaza for the reasons that were just mentioned. One of the facts that I've always found striking and really sort of evocative, when you talk about the sewage crisis in Gaza, which is caused, again, as was just mentioned, by lack of electricity powering sewage treatment plants. The statistic I've heard is the equivalent of 43 Olympic-sized swimming pools a day of raw sewage are pouring into the Mediterranean. That is flowing up, and as we hear, it's having impact on the desalination plants in Israel. It's been closing beaches there for that reason. And so the reason I start with this is, as is the case with environmental factors, things like environment and health do not respect borders. So you cannot contain that kind of crisis in one place. Based on that, we at USIP, in partnership with the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, did a crisis simulation focused on Gaza, and drawing on these these harsh realities, we used as a catalyst for the exercise a public health crisis, a cholera epidemic that, in the scenario stemmed from these poor public health and sanitation conditions. And the goal behind the exercise was to try to test the capability of the various stakeholders played by the actors we had in the simulation to individually and collectively come up with a solution to the immediate crisis, but then ideally longer term parlaying that solution into longer term stabilization and a long-term solution. So I think on some level the actors played their roles a little too well. What we saw is a lot of what you heard from Natan in the first panel, and that I think comes out in the report, that actually all the stakeholders did very well in terms of dealing with the immediate crisis. They all jumped into gear, resources were collected, border was open to let aid in. The minute the immediate crisis subsided, the incentives declined for actors to take very proactive steps against their own interests. So everybody was.
And this was a cholera crisis.
This was a cholera crisis. Again, a hypothetical used for the purpose of trying to stimulate sort of creative solutions and action. So once in the simulation that was contained, and we started trying to move towards now how do you take this and create longer term solutions, everybody, as we just heard in the first panel, you start to see this a contained Gaza being a comfortable Gaza for everyone, of course, other than the Gazans who are living in these conditions. And it's this collective action problem. You have all these stakeholders who cannot coordinate to align their interests to come up with this long-term solution, both humanitarian and political. What did happen by the end of this day and a half exercise, you did have two plans emerge. You had a UN-led one that was more humanitarian focused, and you had an Egyptian-led plan that was much more focused on the political reconciliation. Again, what you needed, and this comes through in the task force report, is that coordinating role to really align those interests and actions.
All right. Dennis, you have outlined for us the sort of tricky situation that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in with having his really solid Likud base that is there in southern Israel, who are seeing their fields burned, who are experiencing rocket attacks, versus a larger number of Israelis whose lives go on as normal. So how does that present for him? You've said, it's an electoral challenge that he has less room for maneuver in terms of allowing Qatari money to come in for large-scale projects. He's going to be attacked by his political rivals. So I wonder, how does President Trump's close relationship, or his self-perceived close relationship with Netanyahu, play into this? And the fact that the U.S. declared Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, how does U.S. policy towards Israel interplay with Netanyahu's political prospects in the coming year, helping, hurting, and how does that help the larger, or affect the possibility of a larger Gaza solution?
Well, I do think there's an irony here. I do think, and Ilan said this, I think there was a period where the administration really was focused on Gaza and doing something on Gaza, in part because they believed that, in fact, if Gaza blew up, it would create an environment that was really bad for the presentation of the Trump peace plan. Mm-hmm. Somehow, because of, I think, the natural instinct to adopt the posture of maximum pressure, which tends to be a kind of emblem that President Trump believes works in diplomacy. He believes that it's worked at North Korea. He believes it will at some point work with Iran. They've applied that to the Palestinians, and that's what led to a cutoff of assistance. So even though I think there's still an understanding within the administration that if Gaza blows up, it complicates the larger context for the peace plan, to the extent to which there is a presumption that the relationship between this administration and the President and Prime Minister Netanyahu can be used for peace purposes, it tends to be focused far less on Gaza and far more on the presentation of the plan, which I do believe they're going to present. I believe they'll present it in the first quarter of this year, and I do think they feel, having done so much for the Israelis, to quote President Trump a couple of months ago, it's now the Palestinians' turn. We actually haven't seen that in terms of behavior, but that is something that he said. And I do believe that kind of is embedded in the process. It will not be easy for this Israeli government, this Israeli prime minister, to say no to that plan. Obviously, a lot depends upon what's in that plan, and nobody knows at this point what's in the plan. One other element that I think is interesting is that there still is a presumption within the administration that they very much need some level of Arab leader, if not support, at least some acknowledgement or recognition that the plan is serious. And to get that, there's going to have to be enough content, and I would say as it relates to a Palestinian state, but also I would say a significant part of Arab East Jerusalem being a capital for that state. That will be very difficult, certainly for this Israeli government. It won't be easy for this prime minister, but I do think the nature of the relationship, the way the prime minister has certainly built up his relationship with Trump, and how how important Trump has been for Israel, it does make it difficult for the administration, for Prime Minister Netanyahu not to be responsive to the president when it comes. The question is, can something be incorporated as it relates to the ground up, not just this peace plan? I don't remember if it was Elon or Netanyahu who said it. There's no doubt that there will be a significant economic part of this plan. The question is, how much of it is sort of oriented towards Gaza? I do think there is a lot that could be done even before the plan. Had assistance not been cut off to Palestinians, by the way, it would have made it easier for Arab leaders to find a way to be responsive. By cutting off assistance to Palestinians, in addition to other steps that were taken that you were enumerating, the political space for Arab leaders to be responsive to the administration has shrunk. The irony is that actually could argue for enhancing the content of the plan, at least from an Arab perspective. Whether or not that'll be the case remains to be seen.
And who on the Arab side will take leadership and ownership and vouch for it is also a question. I want to ask Khalid about that. But one last thing, while having you sitting here, I want to take advantage that, with some breaking news here of these latest charges that came out yesterday in Israel. Do you think those imperil Prime Minister Netanyahu's position at all, especially in the run-up to an election?
It's politics in Israel a lot like politics here. It's very polarized. If you are a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the latest charge isn't going to affect it. If you're an opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu, all it does is confirm all the reasons why you don't like him. The real critical question is there some swing vote there that will be affected by this? And I think a lot depends upon whether or not the Attorney General acts in advance of the election. In a sense, these cases have been out there for so long. Every time the police make a recommendation, they made a recommendation in the first two cases some time ago, a recommendation for indictment. And if you go back and you look at polling in Israel, you'll see that actually the Prime Minister's position improved in the aftermath of that. So I know that everyone is a creature of the moment, and all the stories that are written suggest, boy, this is a big turning point. Before you go and bet the mortgage on this being a big turning point, I would take a breath. A lot depends upon what the Attorney General does.
All right. Khalid, I want to sort of ask you a variation of the same question, which is, first of all, if we look at U.S. policy and how it interacts with the possibility of completely reimagined approach to Gaza, I think that, you believe that the George W. Bush era policy of sort of ignoring Hamas and hoping that will, sort of make them disappear, that hasn't really worked. So tell us what you think is going to make it work better now, and also who on the Arab world side is going to take ownership of what we've described to be able to sort of help champion it and push it through. Of course, the Trump administration had hoped that person would be MBS in Saudi Arabia.
Stock
maybe
has gone down.
Well, maybe we can talk a little, I don't know, not with Putin, based on that hand little thing that they did. Maybe you can tell us where you see that going.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to point out that my reading of this administration and trying to make sense of what is motivating it, I think we can't discount ideology and partisan considerations and domestic political considerations. I think that's what was driving the Jerusalem Declaration and the decision to move the embassy. This was not a considered, decision based on a deliberative process, bringing together the intelligence community and the foreign policy establishment and arriving at this decision based on a view that this is somehow good for long-term American interests. This was, I think, almost exclusively a decision based on domestic politics. And if we look at the personalities who are involved in shaping these policies, they all come from a particular ideological view that is very much, I think, reflects the Israeli right, and in some cases maybe even the far right. So they approach this, I think, from a very different place than previous administrations have. And I think pressure is one motivation in terms of cutting off aid and expelling the PLO from Washington. But I think ideology is driving a lot of those decisions. And so I'm less, I suppose, looking forward to or anxious about what is in a presumed Trump plan, because we already know sort of the big picture. We know that Jerusalem is off the table because those are the words that the president has used. We know that the refugees are off the table because, again, those are words that the president has used. They're trying to unilaterally determine the outcome of these issues. So I don't think there's a lot there for Palestinians to feel hopeful for, unless we consider reversing the past decisions that have been taken, like the aid cutoff and so on. If we consider those as potential carrots, in which case we've really lowered the bar, that if you sign on to our peace proposal, we'll allow the PLO back to Washington. We'll reinstate some of the aid to the Palestinian people. If those are what are envisioned in terms of carrots, then I don't think there's a lot of hope for this peace plan. But as far as the thrust, remind me again, the thrust of your question was?
Well, on the one hand, it was whether the U.S. needs to come to terms,
Right.
whatever administration is in power in Washington,
Right.
with Hamas as part of the Palestinian political governing structure. And then secondly, what Arab country do you see out there, or Arab leader, willing to take ownership for a plan to help Gaza and fix what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think in that sense, I think there's even less, as I said before, I think one basic initial step that the Israeli side in particular and this administration or any U.S. administration have to take is they need to come to terms with the fact that Hamas is a political reality. They're not going to blockade it out of existence. In fact, it's not even really clear, when we talk about the objectives of U.S. policy, it's not even really clear what those objectives are vis-a-vis Gaza. What would it take, for example, what needs to happen for the blockade to be lifted? What does Hamas need to dissolve itself? Does Hamas need simply to disarm? Does Hamas need to state explicitly the quartet conditions that have been laid out in a decade ago? It's not clear that any one of those or it's not clear what combination of actions need to be taken in order to end the current blockade. I'm not sure the Israelis have an idea, a clear idea of what it is that they're. So there's a lot of inertia, I think, built into this policy. That said, the previous administration at least had come to the conclusion that we can no longer actively oppose Palestinian reconciliation because that Palestinian division is a major source of instability. I'm not sure that this administration has accepted that the reality of Hamas, has accepted the what is required for Palestinian reconciliation to be concretized, which is the normalization of Hamas within Palestinian politics. I'm not sure that they fully internalize that. But those are things that I think have to happen. As far as on the regional front, the Arab front, that's part of the problem. We don't have, obviously the region is in turmoil. Egypt, which has been traditionally sort of a major interlocutor on behalf of the Palestinians, sort of giving the Palestinians some strategic depth in the peace process with Israel, they are distracted and focused on other priorities, and the one exception being Gaza. So I'm not sure that there is a regional dynamic that is conducive for peacemaking, and there certainly aren't the local dynamics. And I think that's it's why we are where we are.
All right, Lucy, give us something to hope for after this. And I mean, first I'd like to say, the PA and Israel have objected to actions that would empower Hamas. So what role do you see here for outside diplomats from the EU, the US, the UN, Egypt, the Gulf? I mean, is there anything that anyone from outside can do to help move the situation? We've already got the three authors telling us they don't see this as a short-term solution, but to get to this big picture that they want to socialize, that they think could be socialized now for a solution out there, how do we get there?
Sure. So it's definitely not a short-term solution. I suppose to the good news, this is probably a warped way of framing it, is that as we look at the direness of the situation, we are at least seeing, and that's stage one, right, the recognition by a plethora of actors that this is an unsustainable situation. Now, I know people will roll their eyes when we hear the status quo is unsustainable. We've been saying that about all sorts of elements of this conflict for a long time. But again, when you look to the fact that, you know, Gaza's problems are not going to be contained just to Gaza. So for those who even aren't wanting to focus on Gaza, this is ultimately a problem that's going to impact many players' interests. You do have one of the challenges that you raised before in the last panel, Indira. You were talking about these buckets people have of the pressing issues and then the important but not as pressing. And one of the challenges that you have right now is Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian issue at large has become one of those important but not pressing issues until a crisis flares up, right? And then it absorbs everybody's attention. And that's, I think, the value of what you see being proposed here in the plan. Don't wait until the crisis explodes to start thinking about how you manage it. Khaled just talked about the divisions in the region and among the Arab countries. You see the same increasingly in the EU. The EU doesn't necessarily have one unified approach to this. The EU has many diverted priorities. And I think that what you're seeing now with the situation that we've discussed a fair amount this morning, with the US having lost a little bit or a fair amount of its leverage with the PA, given some of the actions it's taken, often the Europeans are looked to be able to exert some leverage and influence on the Palestinians. And so I think there's going to have to be a little bit of a divide and conquer strategy among the parties. And again, this is where the coordinating role comes in. Find the party who can leverage the different points of influence that all these parties have. You have countries that tend to play a more donor role. You have countries that have done a very strong job playing a diplomatic role, Egypt particularly, in this case. And what you need, if you can get, and I actually like the idea by the gentleman suggested before, this is really a chance. It's not just about regional expertise. It's how do you conduct this orchestra? How do you coordinate these different interests and players around the solution that everybody agrees need to happen? Natan got at this point before. With Hamas here, perhaps, is an opportunity, not that Hamas has suddenly become a good faith actor or a decent player in this conflict. But much has been made of this idea is there an opportunity? Are you seeing something different in the behavior of the new Hamas leadership? I heard it put well by an analyst of Gaza I was just speaking to when in Israel. He said, let's not be fooled. Hamas isn't moderating, but it's modernizing. And what you're seeing there is some of the tactics are suggesting that maybe there's some flexibility there that wasn't there before to start where some creativity can start to emerge, where people can start to align their interests. And again, as with so many issues related to this conflict, this is ultimately going to be about leadership, political leadership, and political will. I think you're seeing the will there in a number of actors, and I think we need to see that political leadership emerge.
Well, I mean, given that the U.S. leadership on this is weakened because its leverage with the PA is weakened, so we have that problem. Then we have various Arab states who are sort of potentially using the Gaza crisis to act out their own political rivalries. So that's not incredibly helpful. We have division among the Europeans over what their priorities are. And so who is emerging as the leader who's going to take this on?
Well, I think as we've heard in the discussion this morning, and as I mentioned before, I referenced we had these two plans when we did this simulation that did emerge, again, over the course of this exercise we did. The UN with UNSCO, the coordinator role, and Egypt have been taking leadership roles in this regard. The US still does have leverage. Obviously, it has a lot of leverage with Israel. It does have leverage with some of the Gulf states. And so Again, this will ultimately be, it'll be coordination, it'll be timing, and the hope is that, again, this doesn't wait, because inevitably, invariably, there will be another flare-up. Whether it's a public health crisis, as we hypothetically came up with, I mean, beyond what we're already seeing as a public health crisis there, whether it's another round of violence, which again, we are seeing. We talk about these three major conflicts, but again, something I think Natan pointed out, that's a conservative counting of violent conflicts at this point. You know, the recognition is there that Gaza is at a breaking point. And I think the recognition is there that this doesn't end well for anyone beyond even just the Gazans themselves.
All right, great. Let's open it up to the audience here. I see this gentleman in the light purple shirt. So please identify yourself and make sure it's a question.
Yes, I'm Ori Nier. I'm with Americans for Peace Now. A concern that I've had, and it now has kind of perpetuated through both panels, is whether the talk about an interim political deal, and it's something that I would have loved to ask the first panel as well, actually would serve to impede and undermine a two-state solution in the future, both because, as we know, temporary arrangements, temporary political arrangements between Israelis and Palestinians have a tendency to linger, but also because all parties would have an interest, and I won't go into the details of that, in perpetuating that. So maybe the way to go is to just focus on the economic, humanitarian issues and leave all the political concessions that all the sides would have to make to the big deal, the two-state deal.
Interesting question.
I'll take it. You know, there has always been a kind of conceptual debate, or at least a debate over conceptually about what's the best way to proceed. Is the best way to proceed to try to resolve everything at once, or is the best way to proceed more incrementally? I came to the conclusion a long time ago is that you basically have to do both at the same time. You have to have top-down, but you also have to have bottom-up. No sort of broad plan, whatever it is, if it's completely divorced from what's happening on the ground, is going to have any credibility, certainly at this point. And at the same time, if you want to create greater basis for political buy-in, you got to show that something's actually happening. If it's just words, it's not enough. So something has to actually be happening. In this particular case, because Gaza is at a point of just humanitarian breakdown, you have to do something there. I agree with the notion that you should, wherever you can make progress, you ought to make progress. But I still have this feeling that if the progress is at 50,000 feet, people who live day to day say, why should I believe that? And there is an interesting irony right now, and that is that you actually have not the so-called traditional suspects, but you have Israelis and Palestinians cooperating in very practical ways right now to develop projects to change the reality on the ground, at least as it relates to electricity, water, and sewage treatment. The Arava Institute, with a Palestinian NGO called Demur, have actually developed 14 different projects, each of which for less than $20 million would have a huge impact on water treatment, sewage treatment, and even generation of electricity, and you wouldn't have to wait 4 or 5 years for a desalination plant. And why has this happened? This involves Palestinians, by the way, who used to be part of the PA, because they're fed up, because they look at the reality. So, you know, my sense is you got to do both. And I'm afraid that if it's only humanitarian, first of all, that does limit anybody who's going to invest from the outside. Because they say, why should I invest in the outside? Because the next conflict will blow it up. So I think you really do have to do both. I think the lessons of the past, at least for me, lead me in that direction.
Can I just
Oh,
weigh
yes,
in real quick?
please.
Just a quick point, because I think there's an even deeper problem in trying to, yes, there is potential that an interim deal would harm chances for a two-state solution, but I think there's a deeper problem, which is the consensus around a two-state solution is itself collapsing, or if not actually collapsed. I think we now have a situation where a majority of Israeli cabinet ministers are openly opposed to a two-state solution, to Palestinian statehood. And we have, to a lesser extent, I think, even here in Washington, the party that is in power has officially expunged references to a two-state solution from its party platform. But also we've seen that reflected in the utterances of this administration, where it took 18 months just to get a half-hearted statement explicitly endorsing a two-state solution. And I'm not convinced that their vision of a two-state solution actually involves real Palestinian sovereignty. So that's a fundamental problem, again, I think at the ideological level, that is going to be very hard to overcome, and that is fundamentally different from past administrations, where even if there were conflicts between what administration said and what it did, it was always very clear. The George W. Bush administration very clearly supported the creation of an independent Palestinian state, even if some of its policies, I would argue, were working against that goal. We don't have that anymore. We don't have that clarity of vision by this administration, and I don't think it's something that we ought to take for granted.
All right. Do we have any members of the press who need an answer for their story today? And I already got you earlier. Any member of the press? Are you a member of the press? You seem unsure. Yeah, please. That's a member of the press. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yourself.
Thanks. Mark Montegrifo. I'm a poor freelance journalist. I've got a question on political strategy, both in Israel and over here. I just want to know if you're on the left or if you're on the sort of center attacking those swing voters in Israel, if you're maybe a Benny Gantz or if you're a Yair Lapid, how do you communicate with the electorate regards to Gaza, especially considering that your partner in peace is going to be probably Donald Trump? And also in terms of America, what can the new House, and obviously we saw that vote in the Senate recently on Yemen, can they do anything to kind of control the administration at all on Gaza? Thanks.
What was the second part? I didn't get the second part of it. I got the first part, but not the second part.
What the House might be.
Sorry, I was just wondering what the House could do in terms of pressuring the administration on Gaza, if anything at all, or the Senate, indeed.
Okay. Whether the House and Senate,
The change
whether
in
Congress
House,
can pressure the administration.
Well, look, I think on the first part of the question, there's no doubt that in an election campaign, you're going to see that whomever is, I mean, you'll have multiple parties in what make up what is currently the opposition. They're obviously going to emphasize that they're going to have an approach to Gaza that's more likely to work than the current governments, because they also see a political opening given the attitude and mood of people who live in the South. Whether they can come with what is a credible vision, that's really a challenge. I would say if they were to read this report, there would be a lot in it that they could actually seize on in terms of saying, okay, this is not a giveaway. We get what we need, which is in fact what amounts to it is a deal that with Hamas has Hamas having to do away with its attack tunnels, having to at least stop rocket attacks, has to, at least the implication is a gradual demilitarization. I think that would appeal in Israel, because I think there is a hunger right now for something that is not just another short-term measure that after a couple of months you revisit exactly what you had before, only in a worse situation, because it was actually 500 rockets and mortars that hit within 24 hours. So I think there is a kind of opening there. Part of the problem is that the body politic in Israel today is so disbelieving that peace is possible that the trick is not to look like you're naive. You go back to the 2015 election, the center-left party didn't even use the word peace in the campaign because they thought it would make them look like they were naive. So the challenge is going to be to present an approach that looks like it has a series of elements. That's kind of the beauty of the plan, a series of elements that looks like it actually is a strategy for dealing with Gaza at a time when the perception in Israel is that right now the current government does not have that. I think in terms of the the House and the Senate, you know, there is a potential. Certainly, I think starting in January, in the House, there will be a push, I think, to do some things, including on this issue, and more economically as it relates to, you know, how can you do some things on the ground? I mean, the one I will say, I said before, cutting assistance made no sense if you're trying to create the conditions to get Arab leaders' support for your plan. But cutting $10 million for projects that are joint projects between Israelis and Palestinians, the rationale for that is hard to grasp. If there's one thing that we should be doing, and I think that the Congress might well do, and there is legislation now, there's draft legislation now for this. The House has draft legislation that calls for $100 million for these to invest in these kinds of joint projects. The Senate has a bill that says $50 million. The value of demonstrating that when Israelis and Palestinians cooperate, there's a payoff for it, that ought to be elementary. That ought to be just a given. Anything you're doing should be designed to elevate the payoffs of practical, tangible cooperation, so that at a time of disbelief, by the way, on both sides, the Israeli public disbelieves, but so does the Palestinian public disbelieve. This is something that it's not a panacea, but it ought to be at least one element in a broader approach.
All right, other questions? Yes, let's take this gentleman here first, and let's take another one at the same time from this lady. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. I'd like to ask, given the panelists' extensive experience in this area, if they see the comprehensive nature of this report as ready for something like a Track 2 Oslo process to see if these things can be fleshed out on an extensive level.
Okay, and let's pass the mic over to the lady here who had a question.
Hi, thank you guys for speaking today. I'm here coming from
Could you speak into the mic?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, so House Foreign Affairs Committee is coming in.
And just identify who you are.
Sorry, my name is Sophie. I'm an intern for the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Okay.
And I was just wondering, well, I mean, you guys addressed this a little bit, but I was hoping that you guys could talk a little bit more about solutions that you guys could see, like specific legislation that you would like to see coming from Congress with like a Foreign Affairs Committee that would have, that's interested in seeing movement on this progress on this front, and what specific legislation you guys would like to see coming from the committee itself on like seeing this really happen.
Oh boy, a chance to be prescriptive. Okay, before we get to that, can anyone take the first question?
On whether there's, yeah, go ahead, like Track 2. It was Track 2.
Yes, I think this gets back to what we were discussing before. I mean, I think there is real opportunity here to take the findings and recommendations in this report, and if you want to workshop them, and really it's about, again, it's not just about the substantive issues. Those are fleshed out really deeply in the report, but I think how do you, again, we keep getting back to this issue of collective action, how you get actors to move, how you align interests and positions, and all that classic conflict resolution theory, how you apply that to this. I just want to add on this collective action problem. You see it also, it speaks to the point we were just discussing with the is peace possible, public's not believing that, and the vicious cycle. I'm reminded as I see Shibli Talhami sitting here, and one of the most striking emblematic sort of polling results I've ever seen on this is a poll that I think you did here actually at Brookings that in 2014. Now this was premised on polling Israelis and Palestinians on a two-state solution. And the sort of highlight finding for me of that was, again, a collective action public opinion problem. When you polled Israelis and Palestinians on whether they would accept this kind of deal, a deal that was presented along the lines of what people were assuming up to that point a deal would look like, you would have, you know, and the Israeli, you take the Israelis, you take the Palestinians who said, no, I won't accept it. And you went back to them and said, okay, the other side's accepted it, what would you do? On both sides, their acceptance went up by 10%. Belief that the other side is on board will concomitantly raise the belief of the other side. It's the classic collective action problem, and that speaks very much, and maybe this overlaps the question, this issue of what aid can do, what support for cooperative Israeli-Palestinian projects, all of these efforts that show that peace is possible, that cooperation can happen, particularly around shared interests. I think all of these are things that are vital to address and will really help move the needle forward. Again, we're in an environment where we're not quite sure, as Khaled said, what the political horizon is that we're looking at. But this kind of motivation of giving the Israelis and Palestinians who are living this reality the sense that forward movement is possible is crucial.
All right, Khaled and Dennis, you have an opportunity to write legislation for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Go.
I'm probably the most pessimistic person in this room. I really think that we're at a right now people are expecting the United States to take the lead, and the United States is not taking the lead. The United States is essentially siding with one side, the stronger side, in a very old conflict, and it has no qualms with. I don't know how we get this administration to accept certain realities. The idea that this administration is going to force, for example, put pressure on the Palestinian leadership to reconcile with Hamas is even though I think that's essential, that's what's required. I have a very hard time imagining that either that will come from the U.S. president or that Congress, of all places, will be the one to force the United States to take those kinds of steps. Sadly, I just don't see it. I don't see it happening. It's not going to originate in the halls of Congress. It's not going to originate in the White House. I think we are at a place where the idea of an American-led peace process is a thing of the past. I don't think that exists anymore.
Dennis, do you agree? And do you think that there's nothing that the new incoming House of Representatives could do?
Well, the irony, of course, is that Congress has certain powers. It has the power of the purse, but it doesn't have the power to execute diplomacy. So the legislation you draft, from my standpoint, ought to be focused more on what are the capabilities that the Congress actually has. Here, I already made a reference to it. You ought to be adopting legislation that, first of all, restores assistance to the Palestinians. You ought to be adopting legislation that actually invests in tangible, practical, cooperative projects, because it is a way of demonstrating that, in fact, what I call peace building. There's peacemaking and there's peace building. Peace building is from the ground up. There ought to be legislation that I would like to see also would create incentives for the PA in terms of institution building. Look, there's a big difference between cutting off and threatening and reducing assistance because you're trying to put pressure on. There are also smart ways to put pressure on, which is you say, okay, we're going to store X amount of assistance, and if we, here would be additional assistance for building more of a rule of law, independent judiciary, building institutions. But it's not don't hold it as a penalty, hold it as an inducement. There you actually have a chance, I think, to have an effect. But you're not, the Congress can't lead the United States in terms of peacemaking. You have to have the executive branch prepared to do it. The U.S. has to do that because ultimately nobody else can. I'll just tell, I'll tell a story from when I was our negotiator. The EU, I had a counterpart in the EU who would always complain.
Which time?
Well, in the 1990s.
Okay.
I had a counterpart who was constantly complaining about how he wasn't included in the negotiations. And I used to say to him, look, I'm not the one excluding you. If the parties want you in, you're in, regardless of what I say. If the parties aren't prepared to have you in, it also doesn't matter what I say. You're not in. Nobody else can play the convening, the mobilizing, the framing role that the United States can. Nobody else has the potential leverage to apply on everyone. It isn't to say we can do it alone. Obviously, we can't do it alone. This gets actually to, this is not the Mitchell report, but your Mitchell report, what you were saying about drawing from other experiences. Study other experiences, like, for example, German unification in NATO. What's relevant about it is not the specifics. What's relevant about it is, here was an issue that the punditry class thought was impossible. You couldn't integrate, you couldn't provide German unification in NATO because it was too hard for the Soviets, and the British French weren't enthusiastic about it. And yet it happened. Why? Because American leadership invested heavily in terms of time. American leadership framed the issue, built momentum behind the issue, dealt with all the different parties constantly. I mean, the George H.W. Bush earlier was known as the Mad Dialer. The fact is that, you know, you had a Secretary of State during German unification in NATO, in 1 year's time had 30 meetings with all of his counterparts to manage every issue as it popped up. You had the President of the United States, who held 9 different summit meetings with all the relevant players in this time. You can, if the issue is important enough, if the administration defines it as important enough, you can frame the issue, you can engage in a kind of public diplomacy, you can build momentum behind an idea. You're talking about socializing ideas. You have to frame this in a way that is digestible. You have to create a repeatable mantra. You have to make it an issue that has meaning, and you have to constantly work it. This is something that can be done. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be done now, but I'm saying it can be done, but it has to be a priority.
All right, well, on Shibli, I was going to shut it down, but in deference to you, I will give you the very last, very short question. I think your mic is not on. Well, let's give you another one.
All right, how about
Shibli
this
Talhami.
one? Okay, thank you. Shibli Talhami from University of Maryland, Brookings. Is one thing to argue we have a desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza that needs addressing, and that's really what this report does. It's incredible, it's excellent. I'm proud to be part of it. Another, to pretend like this administration is capable of doing anything good on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I do worry that even by playing along or making suggestions to it and seeing how we could play with it, how we could improve it, we're in essence legitimizing something that is going to be not very good for the U.S., not very good for the Israelis, not very good for the Palestinians, not very good for the region. We have seen nothing at all so far that indicates that there is any room for anything that would be good for the region. And I think there's a cost to kind of try to be creative in dealing with them because in the end, when you playing with something that you know doesn't look good at the core, that you're legitimizing it and you're buying time and you're in a way preventing some additional action that might be done as an alternative.
Well, I think as Shibli's a member of the task force, we can either let that sit in the room as his comment, unless any of the commentators, the discussants, would like to add to it.
I just say, look, I've been doing this for 30 years, so obviously I never give up. So I understand why you say it, Shibli, but the implication of it is, all right, you'll try to work with others. We should, but I think you can't just give up on this, because the U.S. in the end it plays too important a role. Maybe the administration isn't going to respond, but clearly this is an administration that could use ideas from the outside. And Ilan, as you said, they have reached out. So, you know, I think as a basic principle, we should always be pushing on every door that's available. And if it doesn't go anywhere, okay, but at least you're pushing on it. And by the way, anybody else you're reaching out to, let's say the Europeans, they're going to ask you what you're doing with the administration. So you should have an answer.
All right, so Dennis Ross leaves us with the thought of never say never, never give up, which is a good thought to end on. Please join me in thanking the members of the task force, the authors of the report, Dennis, Khalid, Lucy, Brookings, and Center for New American Security. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.